It's the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Perez coming to you from Baltimore. In a Twitter spat Thursday, Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto said he scrapped plans to meet U.S. President Donald Trump next week. The Mexican president tweeted this morning, "We informed the White House that I will not attend a work meeting planned for next Tuesday with the President of the United States." This comes just hours after Trump told the Mexican president that if his country doesn't pay for the border wall, then Peña Nieto should cancel next week's trip to the White House. On Wednesday, Trump signed an executive order to beef up border control and start construction on a new wall between the two countries. Many in Mexico are furious over the timing of Trump's actions, with top Mexican officials currently meeting with the Trump administration. Peña Nieto reacted to the Wednesday night posting by posting a video to Twitter saying, "Mexico does not believe in walls. I've said time and again, Mexico will not pay for any wall." Trump's verbal attacks on Mexico have put Peña Nieto under increasing domestic pressure to act. His approval ratings are at the lowest level of any Mexican president in years. Joining us now to talk about the U.S.-Mexico relations is John Ackerman. John is professor at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. He's also an editor-in-chief of the Mexican Law Review and a columnist with La Jornada newspaper and Proceso magazine. John, good to have you with us.
How you doing, Sharmini? A pleasure as always to talk with you in the Real News.
So, John, tumultuous relations between the U.S. and Mexico. And recently you wrote a very good article in Atlantic Monthly where you said Trump would not be able to do what he's planning without complicity of the Mexican government. What makes you say that? In what way is the Mexican government acting in complicity here?
Yeah, well, it's really kind of tragic, Sharmini, because, one thing is to have this big bully Trump on your border saying that he's going to sink your economy, kick out all your citizens, build a huge wall. But it's quite another thing to have that happening and also to be completely missing any kind of protection from your government. Enrique Peña Nieto and his new foreign secretary are much closer to Donald Trump than to the Mexican people.
Here you mean politically?
I mean politically, and I mean intimately as well. So, Videgaray, the new foreign secretary, was the guy who brought down Trump to Mexico for a campaign event in the presidential palace of Los Pinos with Peña Nieto on August 31st. That was just what Trump needed in his campaign. People talk about Russia getting involved in the U.S. president election, but it was really Mexico which publicly as a foreign government participated directly in this campaign supporting Trump. What Trump needed was precisely that kind of boost to demonstrate that he was supposedly a statesman who can get along with foreign dignitaries, and that he's not a racist. Supposedly, he could show that he's a friend of Mexicans, or Peña Nieto at least, without needing to actually change his policies, anti-Mexican policies. So, this is really kind of sad and very worrisome from down here south of the border. We feel in a state of total lack of protection, total vulnerability. So Peña Nieto has now canceled the meeting. Yeah, right. Well, he waited to the last possible minute. He had already been humiliated by Trump on Wednesday with these executive actions. He should have immediately canceled the meeting, but he, held on until Trump himself basically canceled the meeting. He said, well, if you're not going to pay for the wall, then why are you going to come up here to Washington? And Peña Nieto said, "Oh well, I guess I won't go then." That's not a serious leader, right?
Yeah. So. As I said in the intro, John, Peña Nieto is in the lowest levels possible when it comes to opinion polls. So how are these recent developments in the relationship between Trump and Peña Nieto panning out in terms of the Mexican mood out there?
Well, the Mexican mood is souring by the day. We were already in the middle of a pretty crisis-laden situation, both politically and economically, because on January 1st there was incredible gasoline price hikes as well as electricity price hikes of 20% just on January 1st. Inflation is starting to kick in. The peso has devaluated 50% of the last 4 years during the Peña Nieto administration. And politically, there are mass protests. Originally motivated by these gasoline price hikes, but they've gone way beyond that very quickly and become a protest against Peña Nieto himself. Resign Peña Nieto is the most important, consigna that everybody is yelling at the marches. And so things are getting very complicated for Peña Nieto and for Mexico in general. The hope is that we are getting close to election season in 2017. There are very important state-level elections in Mexico State, in Coahuila, in Nayarit. Next year, there will be presidential elections. López Obrador is getting beefed up by this. The opposition, leftist candidate is getting beefed up by this whole situation. We talked about that at the last segment we did with you a couple weeks ago. So it's not all desperation. There's the Mexican people are mobilized. I just checked Twitter. Evo Morales has officially on his Twitter feed invited Mexicans to return to Latin America and to turn their sights towards the South. I agree with that. This is an opportunity. The end of NAFTA, the building of a wall. This is the end of the Carlos Salinas neoliberal fantasy that somehow integrating Mexico into North America and forgetting about our Latin American roots and history and culture and everything about Mexico is Latin American, of course, that we would somehow reach the first world. This has just failed. The Mexican economy is toward destroyed. The countryside particularly, but the entire economy is fragmented and dependent on the United States. This is a crisis, but there is opportunity toward the future.
Right, but at the same time, for the president of Mexico to be taking on the leader of the free world, as they say, or the American empire here, might be favorable in terms of the election year coming up and in terms of opinion polls. What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, well, he'll try to use it. There's this kind of patriotic streak that he's going to try to use to beef up support for him. But it's going to be really hard. Really, the guy who's getting benefited politically is not the president, but it's López Obrador, because he's the guy who's always been, stubbornly talking about national sovereignty and questioning independence of the United States, while Peña Nieto has been from day one talking about, North America integration, about how wonderful it is for Mexico to be totally dependent on the United States and for us to give over our oil and privatize our oil. So, it's going to be really hard for Peña to do this kind of about face and suddenly become a great patriot.
And speaking of López Obrador, what is going on in terms of the social movements and this massive resistance that's been mounting and swelling in Mexico? We talked about it many times in relation to the students that have disappeared and the resistance against a government that was rising up, and the student movement itself and others. But where is those social movements at this time?
We're in a crucial moment. We're going to have to be very observant of how this develops. And from one perspective, this is just another social explosion. We have these every 6 months to a year in Mexico, massive marches about one or another issue. You remember the Ayotzinapa case, the neoliberal teaching education reform, now the gas hikes. The Mexican population, they get out in the streets and they protest. We don't have a problem with that, with passivity. The problem is that these movements often don't congeal into solid national networks for mobilization, and they've had difficulties constructing alliances with political parties. Specifically, the only party they could really ally with is Morena, left-wing party. And the problem's on the other side too. Morena is a new party trying to get close to the social movements, but there are a lot of people in Morena itself who have this sort of more old guard, more bureaucratic vision of what a party's all about. So the question here is whether we're going to be able to create that leverage between the movement side of Morena and the more politicized part of the movement to really construct a coalition which can achieve a transition towards the left of Mexico, which we desperately need. Mexico's the only country which has not had a transition to the left over the last 20, 30 years in Latin America. Every other country has moved in that direction, except for Colombia. But Colombia, is a special situation with half the country even under the control of the guerrillas and new peace talks. So, really, Mexico is the exception, and we hope it won't be for much longer.
All right, John, I thank you so much for joining us with such short notice, but we look forward to hearing from you again next week.
Thank you very much, Charmaine. A pleasure as always.
And thank you for joining us here on the Real News Network.